Buying bread shouldn't be this complicated, but somehow it is. Walk into any grocery store and you're hit with shelf after shelf of breads claiming to be healthier, more natural, higher in protein, made with better ingredients, or better for you. So, which one actually is? Is Wonder Bread really as bad as people say? Is sourdough really healthier? Is paying twice as much for premium bread actually worth it? Or is a lot of it just marketing? Today, instead of listening to the claims on the package, we're putting 4 very different breads under the microscope. And by the end of this video, we'll find out if we can actually see the difference. Before we put Wonder Bread under the microscope, there's one thing you should know. This loaf wasn't designed to be the healthiest bread on the shelf. It was designed to solve a problem. Back in the early 1900s, fresh bread didn't stay fresh very long. And once sliced bread became popular, keeping every slice soft without falling apart became a real challenge. Wonder Bread helped solve that problem. By using dough conditioners, emulsifiers, and preservatives, they created a loaf that stayed soft, held together, and could last much longer on store shelves. Before we put it under the microscope, let's take a quick look at what's actually inside. Most of the ingredients are exactly what you'd expect: flour, water, yeast, and sugar. But a few stand out: dough conditioners, emulsifiers, and preservatives. Those are the ingredients that help keep Wonder Bread soft, uniform, and fresh much longer than homemade bread. So here's what I'm curious about. If Wonder Bread is packed with emulsifiers, dough conditioners, and preservatives, can we actually find evidence of those ingredients under the microscope? And if we do, what does that tell us about the bread we're eating? There's only one way to find out. Let's put Wonder Bread under the microscope. All right, our investigation officially begins. This is Wonder Bread at 40 times magnification. Remember what we talked about before we ever looked through the microscope? Wonder Bread uses ingredients like dough conditioners, emulsifiers, and preservatives. Each one has a different job. Dough conditioners help strengthen the dough so it bakes into a finer, more consistent structure. Emulsifiers help distribute fats and moisture evenly throughout the bread, giving it a softer, smoother texture. And preservatives help the bread stay fresh longer once it reaches the shelf. So if all of those ingredients are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, I'd expect this bread to look remarkably consistent under the microscope. And immediately, that's exactly what I'm noticing. Everything looks surprisingly uniform, almost as if every bite was designed to be exactly the same. So our first prediction is looking pretty good. Now let's move up to 100 times magnification. At this level, we're getting a much better look at the bread's internal structure. One thing that's easy to forget is that bread is basically a network. As yeast produces carbon dioxide, the gluten proteins stretch around those tiny gas bubbles like a balloon. During baking, that structure hardens into the crumb we eat. In breads that rise unevenly, those air pockets can vary quite a bit in size. But here, the pattern stays remarkably consistent. The air pockets are relatively uniform, which is exactly what you'd expect from a loaf that's been engineered to produce the same texture, slice after slice. Now we're at 400 times magnification, and this is where the bread almost stops looking like bread. At this level, most of what we're seeing is the bread's starch and protein network. Everything has been mixed, baked, and fused together into one continuous structure. And no matter where I move across the slide, that structure stays remarkably consistent, exactly what we'd expect from a loaf engineered for uniformity. Now we've reached 1,000 times magnification. At this scale, I can't point to a single particle and say, that's an emulsifier. Science doesn't work that way. But what we can see is the final structure those ingredients helped create. And after examining Wonder Bread at every magnification, the evidence points to one conclusion: this loaf was engineered to be as consistent as possible, all the way down to its microscopic structure.
Before we move on to our next case file, you guys, I want to thank HTPOW for sponsoring today's video. They reached out and asked if I'd put their electric mason jar vacuum sealer to the test. So I did. I use mason jars all the time around the lab for storing samples, ingredients, and supplies. So this was actually something I could see myself using every day. And guess what? Using it couldn't be much easier. the seal on top, make sure it's on there. Put the mason jar sealer over the top like this, fits on snug, and there's a button on top. Push that button, and in just a few seconds, you've got a vacuum sealed jar. It's pretty cool. Whenever a company sends me a product, I want to know one thing: does it actually do what it claims? And after putting this one to the test, I'd say it passed. If you'd like to check it out, I'll leave a link in the description below. I actually bought two, one for my mom and one for me. Now, let's get back to file case number 2.
Now that we've seen what one of America's most iconic white breads looks like under the microscope, it's time to move on to our next case. This one couldn't be more different. If Wonder Bread was designed to be soft, smooth, and remarkably consistent, Dave's Killer Bread was built with a completely different philosophy. Instead of refined white flour, it's packed with whole grains, seeds, and ingredients that preserve more of the grain's natural nutrition. Before we put it under the microscope, let's take a closer look at how Dave's Killer Bread came to be. Dave's Killer Bread has one of the most unusual stories in the bread aisle. It all started in a small family bakery in Oregon, but the Dave in Dave's Killer Bread wasn't always there. After spending more than 15 years in prison, Dave Dahl returned home and went back to work in the family bakery. Instead of making another traditional loaf of white bread, he wanted to create something different, a bread packed with whole grains, seeds, and organic ingredients. The idea caught on quickly. What began as a small bakery experiment grew into one of the best-selling organic bread brands in America. Before we put Dave's Killer Bread under the microscope, let's make a prediction. Unlike Wonder Bread, this loaf is packed with whole grains and seeds. Those ingredients create a bread with more texture and more natural variation. So, if that's true, I'd expect this loaf to look much less uniform under the microscope. There's only one way to find out. Let's put Dave's Killer Bread under the microscope. Our investigation begins at 40 times magnification. And compared to Wonder Bread, this difference is immediate. Remember our prediction? Because Dave's is made with whole grains and seeds, we expected to see a structure with much more variation, and that's exactly what we're finding. Instead of one smooth, consistent appearance, we're seeing larger fragments, darker particles, and a much more rugged texture. Already, this bread is telling a very different story. Now let's move up to 100 times magnification. The closer we look, the more obvious that difference becomes. Whole grain breads aren't made from just the starchy center of the wheat kernel. They also include the bran and germ, which add texture and complexity to the loaf. And while we can't point to a specific ingredient under the microscope, we can see the result. This structure is far less uniform than what we observed in Wonder Bread. Now we're at 400 times magnification. As we zoom in, those larger fragments begin blending into the bread's underlying structure. The dramatic differences we saw at lower magnification become much less obvious as we're now looking deeper into the material itself. At 1,000 times magnification, the bread becomes almost completely abstract. Just like Wonder Bread, we're now looking at the microscopic structure rather than the loaf's overall texture. But by this point, the evidence is already clear. Dave's didn't look different because of clever marketing. It looked different because its ingredients created a noticeably different structure from the very beginning. After looking at Dave's Killer Bread, one thing is already becoming clear. Different ingredients really can change what we see under the microscope. But our next loaf raises an even bigger question. What happens when a bread falls somewhere in the middle? Not as heavily processed as Wonder Bread, but not packed with whole grains and seeds like Dave's either. Let's open our next case. Nature's Own was introduced in 1977 by Flowers Foods, one of the largest baking companies in the United States. Their goal wasn't to reinvent bread, it was to offer families a loaf that felt more natural than traditional white bread, while still being soft, affordable, and easy to find in almost any grocery store. Over the years, Nature's Own expanded into dozens of different varieties, from honey wheat to whole wheat to butter bread, becoming one of America's best-selling bread brands. But today, we're interested in just one question. Does it actually look different under the microscope? Before we put Nature's Own under the microscope, let's make a prediction. Unlike Wonder Bread, this loaf isn't made to be perfectly uniform, but it's also not packed with whole grains and seeds like Dave's, so I'm expecting something in between. A structure that's still fairly consistent, but with a little more texture and a little more variation. Let's see if that's actually true. Our investigation begins at 40 times magnification, and right away, Nature's Own looks exactly where we expected it to. It's not as smooth and uniform as Wonder Bread, but it's also missing the rugged, seed-filled appearance we saw in Dave's. Instead, it seems to land somewhere in between. There are larger fragments throughout the sample, but the overall structure still feels fairly consistent. So far, our prediction is holding up. Now let's move up to 100 times magnification. The closer we look, the easier it becomes to see that balance. This loaf still has more variation than Wonder Bread, but it's noticeably more organized than Dave's. It's almost as if Nature's Own borrowed a little from both worlds. Now we're at 400 times magnification. As we zoom in, the larger pieces begin blending into the bread's underlying structure. The differences become less dramatic, as we're now looking deeper into the material itself. Now we've reached 1,000 times magnification. At this scale, you're no longer looking at crumbs or even the overall texture of the bread. What you're actually seeing is the microscopic network that's left behind after the dough was mixed, proofed, and baked. The starch, proteins, and other components have all fused together into one interconnected structure. That's why, at this magnification, all three breads begin looking much more alike. The biggest differences weren't hidden down here. They were at the lower magnifications, where each loaf's ingredients shaped its overall structure, and that's exactly what we found. So far, we've looked at breads designed for convenience, consistency, and nutrition. But our final loaf takes a completely different approach. Fresh sourdough doesn't rely on commercial baker's yeast alone. Instead, it's made through a slow, natural fermentation that can take days instead of hours. Many people believe that process creates a healthier, more flavorful, and more natural bread. Before we find out, let's take a closer look at the story behind sourdough. Sourdough is one of the oldest forms of bread ever made. Long before commercial yeast existed, people relied on wild yeast and naturally occurring bacteria in the air to make their bread rise. That slow fermentation process has been used for thousands of years, and it's still how authentic sourdough is made today. Instead of rushing the dough, bakers give the microorganisms time to break down the flour, develop flavor, and create the bread's signature texture. But here's what I'm wondering. After thousands of years, does that ancient process actually leave behind a different microscopic structure? Let's find out. Before we put sourdough under the microscope, let's make one final prediction. Unlike the other breads we've looked at today, sourdough develops through a slow, natural fermentation. That process creates its signature texture and those large, irregular air pockets. So if fermentation really changes the structure of the bread, I'd expect sourdough to look less uniform than Wonder Bread, and maybe even different from Dave's. There's only one way to find out. Let's put sourdough under the microscope. At 40 times magnification, this immediately looks different from the breads we've already examined. Instead of a fine, uniform texture, we're seeing larger, irregular pieces spread throughout the sample. That matches what we'd expect from a loaf with a much more open crumb structure. Right away, sourdough appears less engineered for perfect consistency and more defined by natural variation. Now at 100 times magnification, those larger fragments become even more obvious. Instead of blending together into one repeating pattern, the structure still looks uneven from one area to the next. That's important because bread isn't just made of flour, it's a network of starch and gluten that forms as the dough is mixed, fermented, and baked. The more variation we still see at this magnification, the more unique that network appears across the sample. At 400 times magnification, something starts to change. The larger pieces begin losing their individual identity and instead start blending into a much more continuous structure. That's exactly what happens as we zoom deeper. Instead of looking at crumbs, we're beginning to see the microscopic material that those crumbs are actually made from. And here, at 1,000 times magnification, almost all of the larger structure has disappeared. What we're mostly seeing now is the underlying starch and protein matrix that holds the bread together. By this point, the differences between individual crumbs matter much less because we're looking at the microscopic framework beneath them. So while sourdough clearly looked more irregular at lower magnifications, at this scale, its underlying structure becomes much more familiar. After looking at every loaf, comparing every ingredient, and examining each one under the microscope, it's time to reveal the results. Now remember, this ranking isn't based on taste, price, or popularity. It's It's based entirely on what we observed during this investigation. So, which bread stayed closest to its natural structure and which one appeared the most heavily processed? Let's find out. Coming in at number 4, yes, you guessed it, Wonder Bread. From the very first magnification, one thing became immediately obvious. Consistency. Nearly every field of view looked remarkably uniform, with very little natural variation. That's exactly what we'd expect from a loaf designed to be soft, consistent, and have a long shelf life. Now, that doesn't automatically make Wonder Bread unhealthy, but compared to the other breads we tested, it displayed the most processed appearance under the microscope. Taking the number 3 spot, Nature's Own. This bread landed almost exactly where I expected. Under the microscope, it showed more natural variation than Wonder Bread, but it never reached the level of complexity we observed in Dave's Killer Bread or the fresh sourdough. As we increased magnification, those differences gradually blended into the same underlying microscopic framework we saw in every bread. Overall, Nature's Own struck a nice balance. It wasn't as uniform as Wonder Bread, but it also wasn't as structurally diverse as our top 2 contenders. For this investigation, Nature's Own earns the number 3 spot. Taking the number 2 spot, Dave's Killer Bread. From the very first look under the microscope, this bread stood apart from the commercial white loaves. Its structure was far less uniform, with larger, more irregular fragments remaining visible as we increased magnification. Those differences likely reflect the loaf's whole grain ingredients and less refined texture, giving it a noticeably different appearance than the more processed breads we examined. But as we continued zooming in, even Dave's began revealing the same underlying starch and protein framework we observed across every loaf. Still, throughout this investigation, Dave's consistently retained more natural variation than either Wonder Bread or Nature's Own. That earns it the number 2 spot. And finally, taking the number 1 spot, fresh sourdough. From the very first look under the microscope, this bread immediately stood apart. Its structure was the most irregular, the least uniform, and showed the greatest natural variation of every loaf we examined. As we increased magnification, those larger differences gradually gave way to the same underlying starch and protein framework shared by every bread in this investigation. But that's exactly what made sourdough so interesting. Even though all 4 breads eventually revealed a similar microscopic foundation, sourdough retained the strongest visual evidence of its unique baking process at the magnifications where those differences mattered most. Now, does that automatically make it the healthiest bread? No. A microscope can't measure nutrition, digestibility, or how your body responds to a food. But based solely on what we observed through the microscope, fresh sourdough earned the number 1 spot.
Well, I definitely wasn't expecting that. Going into this, I thought the differences would just keep getting bigger as we increase magnification. It turns out the opposite happened. That's why I love doing these investigations. Every time I think I know what I'm going to find, something surprises me. If you'd like to learn how I prepare these slides, capture these microscope images, and get the most out of your own microscope, check out the Visual Scientist Lab Manual. I put everything I've learned into it, and every purchase helps support this channel and fund future investigations like this one. If you got another food you'd like to see under the microscope, let me know down in the comments. A lot of my best ideas have come from you guys. Thanks for hanging out with me today. Take care of yourself and others.